even as a child, I did like mathematics and sort of mathematical reasoning, and I like physics, and I like computers, and actually I like just about everything except statistics. I didn't really study during my undergrad days and so on. But when I started graduate school, I actually thought I wanted to do mathematical physics, but then that got really technical and high dimensional and not so easy to relate to the kind of physics that I liked. And then meanwhile, I was just auditing a course in mathematical probability theory, and that seemed to have a lot of interesting problems and be more sort of accessible, and you could really think about what was going on. And so I ended up becoming sort of a mathematical probability person. And then when I was applying for academic jobs, I ended up with this job in the statistics department at University of Toronto, and they were happy to have me keep doing more of the pure math probability, but I gradually moved more into other statistical applications and sort of applying, probability and statistical reasoning and other areas. And then separately, I wrote a book for the general public called Struck by Lightning, The Curious World of Probabilities. And that was an attempt to kind of reach out to a more general public instead of all the really technical stuff that I mostly did. So then that book surprisingly actually did quite well. And I tried to make it entertaining and people enjoyed reading it. And especially up here in Canada, it made some bestseller lists, and I did a lot of media interviews and stuff. So I started doing a lot more outreach and reaching out to other areas, and that led to other interviews and things. And I guess the specific road here is because I was invited by, Wired Magazine runs an online interview thing where they have experts answer questions from Twitter. And they got me to do that, and they posted that, and apparently it's received like over 1 million. It might now be over 2 million hits or whatever. And then your CEO, the CEO of chess.com, decided to contact me to look into these issues, the statistical issues related to cheating or to streaks in this online chess. And it was because he'd seen my Wired video, which came out of the book, which came out of all the things. So I guess it's been a bit of a long road to get here. So I actually played chess as a child as well, and that was, again, a sort of family influence. I guess my father and his father and an uncle all played chess, and so I played in, elementary schools, chess club, whatever, but then they took me to some tournaments. Now, I never became a very high-level player, but I probably peaked at the age of about 10 or 12 when I was, almost as good, maybe not quite, but almost as good as I am now, which is not super good. I mean, my rating tends to be in the 1,400 to 1,500 range, so sort of, a decent amateur, but not at the level of serious players. So, I always liked it, but I guess as I got more into my math studies, especially to play a long game of chess, if you have 2 hours for the first 40 moves or whatever, then that's really hard thinking. That's kind of like working on math. And if I'm already being a mathematician, I might as well work on that instead. So as an adult, I haven't played too much long, serious chess, but I still play speed chess, including with my half-brother now. We play Fisher Random speed chess from time to time. And so, I enjoy it, and I'm sort of amateur level. And, compared to some people, I'm really good, but compared to the serious people that you deal with all the time, I'm not very good. I had heard a little bit about the issues of cheating in chess. And of course, the big difference, the number one big difference in chess between now and when I was a kid is that now computers are much better than humans, as you well know, and it used to be the other way around. So it used to be if you wanted to cheat at chess, you needed to have a room full of grandmasters in the next room who are advising you, and you're probably paying them and everything. Nowadays, anybody with their computer program on their phone or whatever can have a machine that can play chess better than they can. So it's so easy in principle to cheat just by glancing down at your phone or whatever. And so that's why it's become an issue. And of course, with online chess, it's also harder to monitor what people are doing. And, in some ways, we have the same problem with our exams at university. Students cheat on those too. And, if they can sneak in notes or sneak in stuff on their phone, then they can cheat too. So, there's a big issue of cheating. But then the specific issue that I was asked about, which has been a recent controversy, is, this issue of streaks, and in particular, a certain former world champion accusing people like Hikaru of having streaks which were, so good and so long that I couldn't possibly just be due to fair play, and they must be cheating. So, the first thing I say in the report is that streaks and cheating are not really the same thing. And to be honest, if somebody was cheating at chess in a very consistent way, so every game they did a couple of moves cheating, well, they would appear to be just a better player, and it would be pretty hard to figure out if they were cheating. And, even based on streaks or whatever, you just say, hey, they're a good player. And contrary-wise, someone could have really long streaks because maybe they were on a roll, or they felt good, or they'd been, studying or whatever, and maybe they weren't cheating. So I don't really think streaks and cheating are quite the same thing, but nonetheless, I can see how there's a connection and how people might get suspicious if somebody has a really long streak. So the specific question that I was asked to look at was about, hey, let's look at these really long streaks, and in particular the streaks of Hikaru, as you mentioned, and are they suspicious? Are they, streaks that are longer than you would expect to happen just based on his level of play and by the random fluctuations of the game? The statistician, for me to analyze things at all in terms of probabilities, I had to have some measure of, what's the chance that this guy is going to beat that guy, right? And so, ratings is the obvious thing to use. Now, I know a lot of people are somewhat skeptical about ratings and they have their limitations, but I thought, let's see how good the ratings are as a way of predicting the probabilities of winning different games. And I found that they're actually overall pretty good. But one issue is that the so-called ELO formula, which is this sort of a logistic function for, given my rating and your rating, we look at the difference. And in terms of that, we can say, what's the probabilities? But there were a couple challenges I had. One was that, as you say, it fit the data pretty well, but not quite. And there was this issue of, hey, does white actually have a slight advantage? And then also, it doesn't say the chance of winning versus drawing the game because, and in a way it can't because, if I have a better rating than you, well, maybe I'm going to win more, but maybe, maybe I'm going to tie less. I don't know, like it's an interplay. So it took it to mean that it's sort of the expected score that you'll have, where you get 1 point for a win and half a point for a tie. So then I had to, try to break that down a little bit. First of all, what adjustments are necessary to make it fit really well? And then second of all, what about ties? How would we incorporate them? So I did that based on the data of these 7 top players on chess.com, as you mentioned. And of course, one thing to note is that those probabilities could be quite different in blitz chess versus, long chess. For example, there's a lot more draws in long, a 2-hour each chess compared to blitz chess. So I had to model that, and I came up with a model. And, it's probably not absolutely perfect model, but it fits the data pretty well. And it was a reasonable basis to start computing all these probabilities. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I think, let me just make sure I get this right, but I think it was about a 1/8 chance of a draw if you have exactly the same rating. And then it kind of went down from there. If your ratings are different, then there's less chance of a draw. And also, you mentioned sort of the symmetry thing. And of course, the chance of a tie has to be symmetric, whether it's I've got a higher rating or you do. It's just the rating difference. But the score for winning a game, yeah, as you mentioned, I did find there was a slight white advantage in the score. And I ended up with a formula where it's comparable to 14 extra rating points. So, which is just a quite small amount. So there's just a little bit of edge to white, and then that's for the score. And then for the ties, yeah, it's about 1/8 of games where they have the same rating and in ties, and then it goes down from there. If the ratings are different, it's even less likely. And again, that's quite different than in long form. Like say the old time Grandmaster World Champions, where I don't know, it was maybe less than half, but it was something like a third of the games ended in draws, so it's quite a bit higher. Yeah, well, that, as you say, was a decision. And I mean, I did do some initial work where I had different definitions and so on, and it didn't seem to make too much difference. But the reason I specifically focused on this one in several ways was because, this biggest controversy of this former world champion accusing Hikaru of this extremely unlikely streak was specifically that he had the 46 games in which he'd won 45 and drawn 1. So I thought, I want whatever definition I wanted to include this controversial one. So, you could make a judgment, like I did some where you only look at wins, and as soon as you draw, your streak is over. And that's fair enough. But then you wouldn't get that 46 game streak because the tie would have killed it earlier. And, and you could all say, hey, maybe it's okay to lose 1 game and to draw 3 games and then win 100 games or whatever. So, there's different ways of looking at it. And of course, however you look at it. And then also, at first I did look some because the chess.com people suggested, maybe it's different depending on the time control. Maybe you need to separate the games out by the time control, or also the rating of the opponent. Like sometimes the top players will play players whose ratings are much lower, and maybe we should exclude those games and so on. But in the end, I found those things didn't make too much difference. And the one that fit with this, the accusation, this most controversial streak, was to say, we're going to count all the games in the order in which they were played. We're going to, count a streak, as you say, you can have 1 tie and still keep the streak going. And, it seemed like a fair definition, and also a pretty simple one. And one thing that I find whenever I'm doing sort of statistical analysis or something, you don't want to make too many weird assumptions. Say, well, we're only going to count the games with these ratings, and we're only going to do this, and we're going to exclude that, because the more that you do, then the results could be based on your assumptions more than what actually happens. So I thought, the simplest one is just we'll count all the games and we'll just look for streaks, but we'll allow for one draw so that we get this 46 game streak that was controversial into the mix. But aside from that, pretty much just count all the games. So that's what I did as far as how to count the streaks. Yeah. Yeah, well, one thing with the Hikaru games, the vast majority of them were either a 3-minute or 1-minute games without increment, although there were some of them weren't. But like, for example, his least likely streaks were just those 2 time controls. So yeah, it wouldn't have made a huge difference. But yeah, when I first looked at it, I was like, well, maybe, don't count the ones with these weird time controls, just count the most common time controls. But, then that's a bit weird too. If you say, you had a really long streak, well, he lost a lot of games in the middle, but those don't count because they had a different time control streak. Like, it actually sounds a little bit worse to put it that way when you're talking about a streak. So in the end, I thought, look, let's keep it simple. I mean, you can do it every which way, of course, but it didn't seem like it was making a huge difference, and this was a clear, simple rule. So I just went with that, where if you played some games at 3 minutes and then some games at 1 and then some more games at 3, well, that could all be part of the same streak. Yeah, so that was certainly one of my interests here is, as you say, this issue of, hot hand. And as you say, it goes back a long way in the debate, including in sports, especially it started in basketball. And there was a study, it's probably 20 or 30 years ago now, where they said, hey, we looked at all the, NBA stats of how those players were doing. And we found there's no hot hand. Just because they've scored 3 in a row, it doesn't mean they're more likely to score their 4th one. And a lot of people who play the sport, including I played some basketball in my day, didn't really believe it. It's like, come on, you can feel it. Sometimes I'm shooting pretty well today, and other days, I'm a little off and I'm a little tentative and whatever, and you can feel it, right? So then there were some later statistical tests that said, okay, maybe they didn't actually analyze it fairly, because there's subtle things where you can create a bias where if you're looking at the chance of scoring after you've already scored, well, the more you score, the more chances you have to score after you scored, if that makes sense. So there's some subtle statistical things. And they said, no, actually, maybe there is some form of the hot hand in basketball. So there was this sort of debate going on. And meanwhile, in chess, well, I think a lot of people feel the same in chess. I do. If I'm playing a bunch of speed chains in a row, I feel like, oh, I'm pretty good today. I'm going to get him here. I'm going to get him there. And especially if you're playing the same opponent over and over, you feel like, oh, yeah, I found his weakness. I'm really going to get him now. And, so I was expecting there to be some of that. And of course, any phenomenon like that would affect the probabilities of these streaks a lot, right? Because it's more likely to have a long streak. If some days you're really hot and you win all your games, and other days you're really cold and you lose all your games, well, that means you get long streaks on the days when you were feeling hot. So I thought, I got to figure this out. So I looked at it, as you say, I looked at what you called the excessive score, I guess what I called it. And the idea is that based on the ratings and the probability of draw stuff that I'd modeled, you can say for any given match, what do we expect this guy's score to be in terms of a win is 1 and the draw is a half and so on. So what do we expect? And then how did he actually do? And of course, sometimes you'll win even though the odds were against you or whatever. But when you sort of bring those together, you can say, okay, you got how much was your excessive score? So on average, it should be 0, because sometimes you win even when you weren't supposed to, but sometimes you lose even when you were supposed to win. So that should on average be 0. But then you can look at, as you say, the correlation between successive games. And if there was a real hot hand phenomena, you'd say, hey, if in my first game I did better than expected, which probably means I won, then in my second game, I have a higher chance of winning. So on average, I'm going to have a higher excessive score there. And that would give a positive correlation. So what I did is I looked at what we call the autocorrelation function of these excessive scores, which is to say, what are the correlations between how much I beat or don't beat my expected value on this game versus on the next game, right? And versus on the game after that. And we can look at the lag. What about 3 games later? What about 4 games later? And what I expected was that after one game, there'd probably be some sort of decent correlation, maybe 10 or 20 or 30%, or maybe even more. And then it'd probably be less after 2 games, 3 games, and so on. And I was looking forward to seeing how it went. So I plotted this autocorrelation function. And to my surprise, it was just dead flat at 0. That is to say, it came out with just virtually absolutely no correlation between what would happen, you have an excessive score on this game versus the next one. So it meant that as far as the statistical modeling, it was perfectly valid, it seemed, to just treat them as independent trials. That is, how well you do in this game has no influence on the next game. I mean, of course, your overall ability and your overall rating has effect on all the games, but the fact that you just won the last game doesn't mean you're feeling hot and you're going to be more likely to win the next game. And I was surprised about that, as I think I said in the paper, and I was expecting there to be a little correlation, and then it was going to be a bit complicated to take that into account for the probability of these streaks, and okay, it makes the streaks a bit more likely and so on. But I said, you know what? It's just so much. There's no correlation here. You can just treat the different games as being independent. So that's what I did. that could include overlapping streaks if there was sort of a tie in the middle, but you count it both ways. But yeah, I mean, there were a lot. So I mean, yeah, that was one thing that you might say, oh, he's not going to win more than a few games in a row. But no, over the course of 7,000 games, and of course he's a top player, and especially sometimes he's playing weaker players, so he has a good chance of winning. And yeah, absolutely, as you say, I mean, there's going to be lots of streaks, including a couple hundred that are at least 30 games, and you can say, is that surprising or not? And that's what I had to get into. But just in terms of if you look back over such a long history, you're going to find all kinds of different stuff. Yeah. Chess is a game where if you're much better than somebody else, you have a very, very good chance of beating them, right? I mean, there's some games that have a lot more luck, like even a game like bridge, let's say. Well, there's a lot of skill in bridge, but there's also luck how the cards work out and whatever. And a bad bridge player will sometimes win the hand, even if the better bridge player, had an advantage. But chess, I mean, as you know better than me, if you're a good chess player, you know what you're doing. You're not going to just accidentally give up your queen or something dumb, and somebody's got to be pretty good to beat you. So, yeah, when there's a big rating difference, and there's a reason that the rating formula is that way. It sort of goes down, with this logistic curve, and by the time you're several hundred points higher rated than somebody else, you have a very, very good chance of beating them. So as you say, when I was first exploring the data and saying, let's look at these streaks, I said, what? There's a streak of length 121. Could that even be right? And so I had to figure out which one it was in the data and go through it all, and then, as you already alluded, I found, those were mostly playing against players that were quite a lot weaker. And when I worked out the probability using my model based on the rating differences and so on, I said, it's actually not very unlikely. And, he actually had a pretty good chance of winning, all but one and tying one of those 121 games because they were weaker. So when I started looking at what I call the notable streaks, they had to be streaks that not only were kind of long, maybe at least 30 games, but also were fairly unlikely in terms of the model. They weren't just playing against weaker opponents where it was fairly likely you beat them all. Well, first of all, I should point out that the 10% was what could easily be shown mathematically, as I'll explain in a second. But when I actually did a random simulation to see what does it actually work out, it was more like a 43% chance. So in other words, there's a quite good chance. But the reason there's a difference in those two figures is what's easy to do mathematically is to think of, we've got the history of 57,000 games. And in this case, we're looking for a streak of length 57. So imagine chopping up those 57,000 games into 1,000 different blocks of 57 games. So then they're not overlapping, like his first 57 games and his next 57 games and so on. And the point is, if you play 57,000 games, you have 1,000 different non-overlapping blocks of 57 games, right? So you can sort of think of it as you have 1,000 different independent, separate chances of achieving such an incredible streak. Now, of course, that's not quite true because maybe for some of those blocks, the opponents were actually lower rated. So even if you beat them all, it wouldn't be that good a streak. And so it's just an approximation, but right away you say, well, if something has one chance in 9,000 and something, I'm probably not going to do it. But if you give me 1,000 tries, I have a good chance of doing it, right? And in fact, if you have 1,000 different tries to do something that has one chance in 9,000, you'll have a decent chance. You'll have something like a 10% chance of achieving it one of those times. So, and that's just looking at the sort of independent blocks, that is the non-overlapping ones, because mathematically, if those, you could say, well, you didn't achieve it in your first 57 games, but what about games 2 to 58, you could have achieved it there too, but you probably didn't because it's a lot of overlap with the first one. So the mathematics gets more complicated. So for that, I did a computer simulation. But what I concluded is if you just think of those separate independent blocks, which is sort of one way you could achieve that streak, you already have about a 10% chance. And then through computer simulations, say, what if we just consider all possible ones and just see where the games lie? You have about a 43% chance of achieving it. So whichever way you look at it, but especially with the 43%, it's not that unlikely that if you play for 10 years and you play 57,000 games, at some point you will achieve this incredible streak that has one chance in 9,000. It's sort of a more general phenomenon, something which I sometimes call the out of how many principle. And it comes up really in all kinds of cases. Like I've done some writing about legal cases that used probabilities. And there was an infamous case in England where a woman had two babies, maybe you know it, and but anyway, just to briefly summarize it, so she has two babies. They both die of apparent suffocation, and it could be SIDS. But then they say, oh, it's so unlikely that two different babies would each have died of SIDS that she must have killed them both, and she was arrested and convicted of murder, and a really dramatic story. And one way to think about that is, again, what I call the out of how many principle, where you say, well, how many different families are there in, let's say, England, where they had two boys, and they could have both died of SIDS, but they didn't. And you realize there's millions of such families, and then suddenly it's not that unlikely that one such family is going to have two boys who both die in infancy of SIDS. So when you're saying, hey, it's so unlikely, it's true for this one particular family, it's very unlikely they're both going to die of SIDS, so it doesn't seem that likely, but the chance that somebody somewhere in England would have that is actually pretty likely. So by the same token, I'd say you look at Hikaru's streak, and if you only look at those particular 57 games, yeah, there's only one chance in 9,000 that he would have won all of them except maybe tied one. So it seems really unlikely. But you say, yeah, he's been at it for 10 years. He's played over 57,000 games. The chance that somewhere along the way he'd have a streak of this nature, that actually becomes pretty likely. It is challenging because, of course, there's so many different factors that could go into it. Was it raining that day, and did somebody get enough sleep, and were they feeling intimidated? But also, yeah, when you do play the same player over again, as we all know from our own experience, you get to know their preferred openings and their preferred styles and what things you have to watch out for with them. So it certainly could have an effect. And I'm not claiming that my little statistical report got into every little subtlety, but I mean, I would say, first of all, the hot hand thing that we were just discussing, and the fact that there was really seemed to be no correlation. It did make it seem like even if you do play the same person a few times in a row, it didn't seem to have a huge impact on your probabilities of winning just based on the rating. So that's one thing to say. And then, I know especially if let's say a top player, somebody who's not a top player gets a chance to play them, and that maybe they're intimidated, or maybe they're a fan, or they're whatever, and there could be all sorts of dynamics there. And it's hard to. I mean, you could try to study all those things, but it gets pretty subtle, and I'm not going to claim to have studied every little effect like that. But I will say that a couple of things. One is that, as I say, from the bigger picture of this independence and so on, it seemed like there wasn't any massive such effect, and the fact that the ELO rating formula with my slight adjustments actually seemed to fit the data very well. But also, I mean, another thing that's a bigger picture is, I'm sure with a lot of really careful tweaking, you say, okay, the fact that this opponent was a fan and might have been a little intimidated, we should take 10 points off their rating here. You might be able to come up with something like that, but it would not have a massive effect on the final result. Like, that's one thing to say, is that, in a case like this, you're really saying, hey, are these streaks, really, really unlikely, or do we expect them to come up from time to time? And even if you got very closely into, the psychology of how this one, he was a little bit more likely to win because of these various factors, it might slightly change some of these probabilities, but I do feel that, basically it wasn't that close. Like, it wasn't like this is on the cusp of really unlikely or things that you'd expect. It's like, yeah, these are things that are really pretty expected. So I really don't see, even if you did a super careful psychological analysis, that you'd have much change in the overall conclusion. These are what I call the notable streaks. So they had to be lanes at least 30, but also the raw probability less than 1 in 500, because there could be streaks of lanes 30 that are actually very likely because he was just playing low opponents. So I decided to cut those out and just take the notable streaks where it's at least 30 games in a row, and the raw chance of achieving that was less than 1 chance in 500. And he had a total of 10 such streaks. And yeah, as you say, I did a sort of histogram from this Monte Carlo thing, and his line for that is right in the middle. It's like, the average is 9 point something, and he had 10. And if you look at the graph, there's maybe a little bit more or less in him than more, but it's almost exactly even. And he's really right in the middle. So if you say, how many notable streaks by this definition did he have? He was just exactly typical for that length of play with those ratings. To be honest, at this point, I pretty much finished the report. Okay, I showed that just because he has, his least likely streak is 1 in 11,000 and something, but by the Monte Carlo simulation, it's about 43% chance that it happened over the course of his career. It's really not that unlikely. There's really nothing to see here. And I was pretty much done, but I had this nagging feeling. I thought, well, you had one that was 11,000, one chance in 11,000, and one that was one chance in the 9,000 and something. So that was even a little bit more likely to have one that was that probability. But I thought, well, but having two that way, so you can say having your least likely streak being that there's about 43% chance, and even from the mathematical argument, there's at least a 10% chance. But what about having two? And I thought, well, and as I say, I was pretty much done. Should I bother to do this other thing? I thought, I should think about that, because to be fair, that having two very unlikely ones is obviously less likely than having just one very unlikely one, and I hadn't looked at that. So I looked at, what I call the second least likely streak. That is to say, you say, okay, so his first one, the least likely was one chance in 11,000 and something, but he also had a separate one that was not overlapping that was one chance in 9,000 and something. So, well, I wonder if, how likely that is out of his 57,000 game history to have two streaks, which are both less likely than one chance in 9,000 and something. So I did another Monte Carlo simulation for that. And in this case, I found that about 18%, as you said, of the simulations had, two such streaks, which were both less than one chance in 9,000 and something. And so, 18% is less than 43%. And it says, okay, it's he was, a little bit on the high side in terms of having two such streaks, but still 18% is still quite a bit. And usually, in any statistical study, until something's less likely than about a 5% chance or one chance in 20, you don't even look at it as anything worth discussing. So I'd say, 18% is still not surprising and there's nothing to see there. But yeah, you could say that his having two such unlikely streaks was a little bit more surprising compared to just either one of them on their own. Well, I sort of think of it two ways. One is sort of general, statistical principles and stuff I've been working on for many years and talked about in other contexts like the justice system and so on. And in my book, I talk about is the idea that things that seem really rare are not necessarily really rare when you look at them in the right context. And in particular, like the poor woman with the two babies who died in infancy, it's very unlikely in that one family, but it's not so unlikely that some family somewhere would have that. And there's all sorts of stories that, I've written about some of them where crazy coincidence, people meet on a beach, but then it turns out they were actually half brothers with the same father, but they never knew that and whatever. And, you hear about these crazy stories and you say, well, what's the odds that that person on that day would have gone to that beach and met that person and had this incredible story? It's incredibly unlikely, one chance in millions. But then you say, what's the chance that somebody somewhere would meet somebody who's of special significance to them on a beach, whatever, and depending on how you define it, maybe it's not so likely. And that's a sort of general statistical principle. And in this case, it's a lot more specific. It's saying, hey, let's look at these streaks and this records of online chess. But sort of the same principle that you say, wow, he won 57 games in a row or, 46 in a row or just tied one and seems really unlikely. And first of all, even the streak might not be so unlikely because you have to look at the ratings and everything. And maybe actually to win that wasn't so unlikely. But the bigger thing, I think, is to think just because if you look at just those particular games, it's quite unlikely. But if you say over the course of a 10-year history, so many different games, that somewhere along the way you'd have something that was of that level of surprise, then it's actually not so unlikely. So, the specific conclusion with respect to Hikaru streaks is that, they're actually not at all outside what you would expect if somebody, with that ability and those ratings played those opponents over that 10-year period of those 57,000 games. This is actually pretty typical for what you'd expect in terms of the times he had streaks and the times he didn't. I did see it. To be honest, I didn't go over it in great detail, sort of intentionally, because it came out right while I was working on this stuff. And one of the things that we agreed with chess.com is that I should be doing an independent analysis, but I know there's suspicions and whatever out there. And so in particular, I wasn't paid anything by chess.com, and I didn't, although they provided me with the data and answered my questions, but they didn't tell me how to analyze it or what to do or whatever, just the issues involved. And I sort of felt like that was important because I know there's been some, controversies out there or whatever, and, it's good to have an independent thing. So that second report came out and, I looked at it sort of quickly to get the gist of what they were up to, but I deliberately didn't spend much time on it because I thought, I'm going to do it my own way, not being influenced by what they did. But I mean, having said that, just from glancing at it and from your summary of it, I think absolutely there's some similar principles involved, which is, whatever you determine is going to be, your thing that you're concerned about or surprised about. So whether it's the long streaks of Hikaru or the excessive wins or, overperformances in your Title Tuesday games, either way, you're looking for something that could be suspicious or it could be of concern. But statistically speaking, those things are going to happen sometimes, right? And they're going to happen just due to the usual random chance of, sometimes players overperform and sometimes they underperform and sometimes they win a bunch of games in a row and sometimes they don't. And that's logical. So it's always, as a statistician, the question is always, is what you're seeing outside of what you would normally expect. And so whether it's, hey, you would expect a lot of these long unlikely streaks in the work I did, or whether it's, hey, you would expect some of the players on Title Tuesday to do much better than their rating would indicate or whatever. just because that happens sometimes, then that's exactly what you want to do. And then exactly what what you people did with the report is to say, well, okay, some people did much better than expected, but how many? Is it more people doing much better than expected than we would expect, right? Because you expect the unexpected. You expect some people aren't going to do better than they would normally be expected to do. And it sounds like the basic conclusion for you guys was that it was not too much more than what you would expect. But maybe it was a little bit more, and maybe that does indicate some little bit of cheating. Now, of course, it's complicated too because as we already mentioned, just because somebody does better than you expect, it doesn't necessarily mean they're cheating. And conversely, if somebody's been cheating all along, they might have a really high rating that's all entirely based on cheating, and they might continue to cheat, and it might look like they're just a really good player. So it's hard to separate out the cheating from the unexpected, whether it's the unexpected long streaks or the excessive performance in a Title Tuesday game. But either way, I would say it's the same principle involved, that you're looking for anomalies, looking for things that are beyond what you normally expect, and then seeing how many of them there are. And I know that you guys do an intense job of trying to identify the cheaters, and I know that you suspend people's accounts based on those kind of things. And I haven't been involved in anything like that, to be clear, but it's a reasonable thing to do. And it is tricky. I mean, just like the stuff in the Justice, with the baby, the woman with the 2 babies who died, you don't necessarily want to throw somebody in jail just because something unexpected happens, but you want to try to be fair about it and try to see how much. I know one issue, and this is partially from talking to Dan about it, is that some people were claiming, there's just widespread cheating and Title Tuesday, it's just everybody's cheating. And part of the point of the report, I think, of the report that you guys did was to say, look, there's not huge amounts of cheating because actually the excessive wins are not hugely beyond what we would expect. So yeah, I think there's a lot of points of commonality, but as I say, I didn't look too carefully because I wanted to keep my stuff independent.